That's the next step. Yeah.
I know that they don't do it.
Yeah. So I mean, this time that's the idea. The therapy was interesting, but so I'm not sure. Like there's awareness of the whole congregation.
I'm gonna turn it on. Are they coming in?
That's one of the things.
So last one. Yeah. Wow. Oh, I'm just yeah. Oh yeah. I used to do this. Start a high behind.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We'll be watching a fairly lengthy video this morning, so we should get things started. So we'll still have some time for discussion and reflection after the video. I should first start with St. Mark's Land Acknowledgement Statement. St. Mark's Square sits on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of what is called the San Francisco Peninsula, and who were the first to gather, love, grow, celebrate, cry, and sing in this place. With God's help, we strive to grow toward right relationships with Indigenous people and the earth. With openness of heart and spirit, we hold ourselves accountable to respect and steward the land, its grasses and trees, and creatures great and small. Let it be so in all our relations. So good morning. My name is Marisa Louie, and I'm a longtime member of St. Mark's. It's been a while since I was able to attend an adult forum because I'm usually across the square with our Sunday schoolers. But Sunday school's over as of last week, so here I get to be. So what we're going to be doing this morning, and I feel a little bit like the substitute teacher who comes in and just hits play on the video and sits back. We're going to be watching a portion of a video that was presented as part of the National Day of Racial Healing workshops that were presented by the ELCA this past January. This particular workshop was to explore the journeys, experiences, and challenges of Asian Lutherans against the backdrop of a long-standing history of xenophobia and recent increases in anti-Asian sentiment. Participants examined the concept of Asian and gain insight into the resilience of Asian Lutherans as they navigate complexities, celebrate the richness of Asian cultures within our church, and strive to build solidarity with others. So the presenter's name is Dr. Gaonyu Moa. They are an assistant professor at Augsburg University and the director of the Masters in Social Work program in Augsburg. And the research interests include Hmong American youth, oral traditions, and Indigenous methodologies. We'll be watching a 37-minute portion of that presentation by Dr. Moa, who first contextualizes what is meant by Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI. The largest clip that we'll be watching from this video is the discussion of two concepts that are important for understanding the racialized experience of AAPI individuals. Dr. Moa then highlights some Asian Americans who have been advocates for social justice and for their communities. And then the last 7 minutes or so of this video will be about Asian Lutherans and the challenges and opportunities for AAPI community members in the church. So after we watch this video, we'll have some space for reflection and discussion. Okay, so Peter's going to help me cue up these video clips. I'm just going to run it all as one. There is a break right in the middle. But again, they'll start off by talking about what is meant by Asian American Pacific Islander. Turn this off.
All over the world today. So in terms of who are Asian Americans in the US, you'll see the acronym AAPI. And that term AAPI stands for Asian American Pacific Island. And this is a specific distinction that the US has created, or category, racial or ethnic category that the US has created. And so when we are checking off boxes around demographics, AAPI is the designation that the US government has created Today, more and more so, the Asian American and Pacific Islander separated. And I think that is the general movement. This is the list of who is considered AAPI in the US. And if you're looking at this list and you're thinking it's a long, long list, that's and you know, part of it is like it's overwhelming on purpose, right? There's a lot of people who are considered AAPI. And one of the greatest challenges that we have as people who are part of the Asian American Pacific Islander community is that you know, we are really pushing towards this notion of disaggregated data, that we really want to see specific data about our ethnic groups or data that is really pulled or teased apart more so than this larger AAPI category that the US government has created. So in terms of AAPI, I'll say broadly is that there are 25 million people who identify as AAPI. So 24 million of those are about Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and closer to 1 million people in the US. Just in terms of comparison, that's about 7% of the US population. In terms of AAPI in the US, there are about 100 spoken languages in the US. And these are from the US Census, by the way. 43% of people who identify as AAPI, 43% of those are US born. I think that's important to recognize because compared to the of all US citizens, 86% are born in the US. So what that means is that most people who are Asian American were born in a different country and have either come here and have become naturalized citizens or living and working here. And so it's important to know kind of the different generations of folks who have either immigrated here or resettled here as refugees, who come here for work or have come here to study. And I think that's important to know about this particular community, that it's a relatively newer community to this country. And I think part of that, in addition to that recent arrival, in addition to that is the laws that prevented people from immigrating to the US, specifically from Asian countries. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then lastly, to know about this community is that we are the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the US right now. So I want to share and move into some really important concepts that I think are important to understanding AAPI experiences. And so these are concepts that are two predominant concepts that are important to Asian American experiences. So the first concept is this idea of the perpetual foreigner. And, you know, at the root of this is this notion that no matter how long your family has been in this country, no matter how well you speak English, no matter where you live, you know, how many generations you've been in the US, because of the demographics, particularly around the way that Asian Americans look like, you will always be perceived as a foreigner. And so one of the constant questions that we are often asked is this idea of where are you from? And, you know, sometimes when I share this concept with others, they think, oh, it's just a conversation starter. And I think that is good. I think that the intention, if you are just curious about where someone is from, is, and the context matters. You know, I think sometimes I'm mostly on a university campus, and asking people where they're from is very common, especially because lots of people are coming from different states or different areas. That's one thing. But I've been asked, where are you from complete strangers in an elevator once, you know. And when I told that person where I was from, the following question is, no, where are you really from? And then where are your parents from? And so, you know, part of this is this notion that no matter what, you will always be perceived as not American or foreign. And so I want to kind of show you over time how the perpetual foreigner concept has made its way into not only our understanding and thinking, but in terms of the media and how Asians have been portrayed over time. Again, I just want to offer a content warning. Some of the images I'm going to share with you are disturbing. And yet this is the history of anti-Asian sentiment in the US. So one of the very, very early things is this idea of Asians, or this notion of the yellow peril, that Asians were coming and coming to take over. This is an image from 1881, it's maybe hard to see, but the caption says "The Coming Man," and it's a depiction of someone who this artist perceived to be Asian, and they have their hand, and across their hand says the word monopoly, and it says a bunch of things that they are trying to take over. And these were the images that were used and to perpetuate the stereotype of Asians as coming over and taking. So the yellow peril, that was something to be afraid of. All of this was in preparation for the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. And that was a law that, a federal law that prevented Chinese Americans or Chinese to come to this country to work. Of course, this was after the building of the railroad system, of course. And so there was a real fear that the Chinese were coming and going to take over. So this was in the 1800s. During the 1940s, during World War II and after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, this was an image that was drawn by a beloved children's artist, Dr. Seuss. This particular cartoon is called "Waiting for the Signal from Home." And you can see again how Dr. Seuss has perceived Asian people. These are particularly Japanese folks. And so you can see that along the shoreline is California, Oregon, Washington, where there were large communities of Japanese Americans. And at this point, just know that these are first, second, third generation Japanese. Japanese have been in the US for a long time. And so waiting for the signal from home, you see this person handing out TNTs or dynamite and giving it to long lines of people, and that somehow Japanese Americans were still waiting for the emperor in Japan to give them orders for how they would participate in like terroristic acts. And so this was this notion that even though people who would Japanese and Chinese Americans had been in this country for a long time, that they were still loyal to a different government. And so lots of ways that we were questioning people's loyalty to this country, especially during World War II. Right, some additional images. This particular image is a poster. And this is from 1984. And so if you remember or that particular time, this was a poster that was hung in Flint, Michigan. And there was a huge, particularly around like the auto world, around cars and the shipment of Japanese cars in particular, and how that was impacting the auto industry. And so this was a poster that was hung up at Six Flags theme park in Flint, Michigan. And it was made to criticize the import of Japanese cars to the country. Again, these depiction of who they believed Asian people looked like, lots of like really exaggerated facial expressions. Again, this was a poster that was hung at a family theme park in Flint, Michigan. This is another photo.
Shouldn't touch this.
this is an actual photo. This is not like a painting or anything, or this was a photo that was a fundraiser event by the United Auto Workers Union in 1984. This was in Pennsylvania. And for $1, you could take a sledgehammer to a Japanese-made car. And that's how they were doing raising funds for the union. And so, you know, when we look at these particular imagery or these, you know, these narratives, I think part of it was absolutely like the people's frustration, like there were lots of people who were laid off. This idea of the auto industry was changing rapidly. And so there was a lot of people who were really upset, and the government and the larger media narrative was that it was really, you know, the Japanese imports that were coming in. How did this manifest to people? So one was this, what was the killing of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a Japanese-American man who lived in Detroit, Michigan. And it was the night before his wedding. He was out hanging out with friends, having his bachelor's party. They were at a bar where at that particular bar, two gentlemen walked in, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz. And they, Ronald was the stepfather to Michael. Ronald worked at a plant, an auto plant. Michael had just been laid off from an auto plant, and he was, you know, really upset and saw a group of you know, Asian Americans celebrating. Of course, he just thought they were all probably Japanese and frustrated. They got into an argument, verbal argument. Vincent Chin and his friends left. Ronald and Michael went and got a baseball bat. And on the streets of Detroit, they beat Vincent Chin to death. And so he was killed on June 19th in 1982. The court case has been studied over time. It's become an important court case as we think about racial bias in the US and whether or not we can charge people against racial bias when in criminal proceedings or civil rights cases. And so at the state level, the state criminal charges, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz were fined $3,000 each and received no jail time. The family then proceeded to, at the federal level, in terms of civil rights cases, Evans was found guilty, but he won on appeal. And then Nitz was acquitted on both accounts. And so we have individuals who were never, you know, held in terms of the justice system. And so Vincent Chin was killed because there was a belief that he was a foreigner or part of the frustrations that people had against Asian Americans. And so that was in 1982. And then this is a cartoon, political cartoon that was drawn and was published on January 27th, 2020. And you'll see that in the center it says Chinese exports and has a bunch of things that are made in China and brought to the US. And then in addition to that, the coronavirus. And so, you know, there was huge kind of increasing anti-Asian sentiment and attacks, particularly during COVID-19. You had not only adults who were being targeted, but stories of children. My own nieces and nephews who went to school who were told that they were a virus, and kids who were making fun of them. And so that was the large narrative, particularly around this time of, what it meant to be Asian American was this notion of being a virus. And so, the long history of anti-Asian sentiment in this country really is an important backdrop to understanding the Asian American experience, but also this, as we're connecting it today, the Asian Lutheran experience. All right, so the perpetual foreigner is one concept that is important to understand. The other concept that is really key to understanding Asian American experience is this idea of the model minority. I have a short video that we'll watch together, and then I'll share some more information about this particular stereotype. So hopefully, I think there might be a little ad at the beginning. I'll try to move us along from that, and then we'll watch the video together. I will also have the captions on too. Hopefully the sound works. It's fine.
In 2007, researchers surveyed over 180 teachers to understand if they held stereotypes about students in 3 racial groups. The results surfaced several negative stereotypes, labeling Black students as aggressive and stubborn, white students as selfish and materialistic, and Asian students as shy and meek. But regardless of the teacher's other biases, the most commonly held opinion was that Asian students were significantly more industrious, intelligent, and gentle than their peers. On the surface, this might seem like a good thing, or at least better than other negative characterizations. But treating the seemingly favorable stereotype as reality can actually cause a surprising amount of harm to those it describes, those it doesn't, and even those who believe it to be true. This image of humble, hardworking Asians is actually well known as the model minority stereotype. Versions of this stereotype emerged in the mid-20th century to describe Chinese Americans. But following World War II, the label became commonly used to claim that Japanese Americans had overcome their mistreatment in U.S. incarceration camps and successfully integrated into American society. Former incarcerees were praised as compliant, diligent, and respectful of authority. In the following decades, model minority became a label for many Asian populations in the U.S. But the truth behind this story of thriving Asian Americans is much more complicated. During World War II, the U.S. government tried to Americanize incarcerated Japanese Americans. They did this through English language classes, patriotic exercises, and lessons on how to behave in white American society. When incarcerees were released, they were instructed to avoid returning to their own communities and cultural practices, and instead integrate into white society. But after decades of anti-Asian policies and propaganda, white Americans had to be persuaded that Japanese Americans were no longer a threat. So the government organized media coverage to transform the public perception of Japanese Americans from suspected traitors to an American success story. In fact, the phrase model minority was coined by one such article from 1966. But this article, and others like it, didn't just cast Asian Americans as an obedient and respectful model minority. They also criticized so-called problem minorities, primarily Black Americans. Politicians who were threatened by the rising civil rights movement used this rhetoric to discredit Black Americans' demands for justice and equality. They presented a fabricated story of Asian American success to paint struggling Black communities as inferior. This narrative put a wedge between Black and Asian Americans. It erased their shared history of fighting oppression alongside other marginalized groups and pit the two communities against each other. In doing so, the model minority myth also enforced a racial hierarchy, with white Americans on top and everyone else underneath. Certainly, many people who still believe the model minority stereotype, either consciously or unconsciously, might not agree with that idea. But comparing the imagined strengths and weaknesses of racial groups places value on how well those groups meet certain standards, typically standards set by a white majority. In this case, the model minority stereotype suggests that marginalized groups who are compliant, gentle, and respectful of white authority are deserving of tolerance, while groups that challenge the status quo are not. This stereotype also negatively impacts the Asian individuals it describes. According to a psychological phenomenon known as stereotype threat, members of a group often place pressure on their individual actions to avoid encouraging negative group stereotypes. But this phenomenon can occur around seemingly positive stereotypes as well. The pressure associated with living up to impossibly high standards can lead to poor performance. And teachers are less likely to notice when Asian students are struggling. Outside the classroom, social programs catering to Asian communities are frequently overlooked or cut because they're assumed to need less support than other disadvantaged groups. The favorable portrait created by this stereotype can also make it harder to recognize racially motivated violence and discrimination against Asian Americans. And since the stereotype carelessly groups all Asians under the same umbrella, it impacts people with various backgrounds and unique histories of discrimination. So while the model minority label might appear to benefit Asian populations at first, in practice, it works like every other racial stereotype. It reduces a group of people to a one-dimensional image. And that single image hinders our ability to understand the history, struggles, and triumphs of the individuals within that group. Acknowledging and challenging these labels is essential for building coalitions across communities and eliminating harmful stereotypes for good.
Right, so that was a video just to introduce us to this concept of the model minority.
To learn.
And so, I share that because I think it's important to understand that, oftentimes when we think of these, what are positive stereotypes about Asians? I think people are like, oh, this is great. You are hardworking, you are quiet, you don't make trouble, you're smart. All of those kinds of stereotypes create these narratives, both within the Asian American community, but also within larger communities. And it's used as a tool, as the video said, to really create wedges or divide among the different groups. And so I wanted to show some images of how that plays out. This is, if folks remember, I think about 2 years ago, this has been a long debate, but 2 years ago in particular, there was the Supreme Court was hearing a case about affirmative action. And on the one hand, and so the images on your left-hand side are Asian Americans who really, sided with folks against affirmative action. That you had Asian Americans who really believed that affirmative action was hurting Asians because schools like Harvard and Yale were not taking Asian Americans because they were taking African American students or Latinx students more so than Asians. And so they were really siding against, and then they were co-opting. This is an image where an Asian woman is holding a sign that says, I am Asian American, I have a dream too. And so co-opting, Dr. Martin Luther King's famous speech. And so that, being judged on the content of their character, not the color of the skin. And so really co-opting these ideas to perpetuate this idea that affirmative action was hurting Asian Americans from being accepted to these Ivy League schools. And then at the same time, you had other Asian Americans who were really working around solidarities and really working with other groups, particularly minoritized groups, to really support affirmative action and affirmative action efforts. And so on the left-hand side, you see at the same rally at the Supreme Court, you have people, Asian American students who were trying to talk about that their race was an important quality of who they are, that they were really, committed to solidarity work, and around diversity and inclusion. And so, the ways that the model minority shows up in the community, right, really depending on these different lived experiences really shows up differently, impacts people differently. I think that's important to notice. And so one of the very most famous images of the model minority was this Time magazine image that was published in August of 1987. Just, and I think those dates, those years are important to notice, right? Because this, the media, and particularly the government, was trying to really portray Asian Americans as, that they were these smart kids. And here it says those Asian American whiz kids, right? And, dressed the way they look, what they're wearing, the smiles on their face, right? All of these things were really in comparison to one particular other group. So this was in 1987. And of course, this was a complete contrast to how the media and government was talking specifically around Black Americans and African Americans. And you saw in that video that, it was very purposeful, right? The sort of the characteristics that they were using to describe Asian Americans were very, very different from the images and the narratives that they were, and the words that they were using to describe African Americans and Black Americans. And so in 1987, right, all of this is really important timing, because when we get to the 90s, a really important part of history happens in Los Angeles around the beating of Rodney King and the violence that erupted from that time. And so the racial uprisings following the acquittals of Rodney King's trial, the targets then became Korean store owners, and then created, again, perpetuated this narrative of this Asian and Black experience of really competing and pitting these two particular groups against one another. And so that becomes a really important narrative. What people weren't telling you was that there have always been Asian Americans who have been working towards racial and economic justice. And I want to share some of those individual images and individuals with you today. And so this is a picture of Yuri Kochiyama, who was from California and then moved to New York, where she met Malcolm X in 1963 and was part of his work during doing racial justice work on the East Coast. And she is, if you've seen some of the images when Malcolm X was assassinated, she is the woman who is cradling his head at that particular meeting. And so this is an image of her, and she's been, had been a very outspoken, an important supporter of racial justice work. You had Filipino farm workers who went on strike in 1965, and they were working on grape farms, and they eventually then started working with Cesar Chavez and the American Farm Union workers. And so they were part of the strike that happened and working towards fair wages for people. Here you have students, Asian American students, who were protesting during 1969 during the anti-war rally in San Francisco. And some of the signs, it's hard to see, but some of them say, are talking about withdrawal, withdrawing from Southeast Asia, support our Asian sisters in Vietnam. Here you don't see it, but there's some other signs that, about Asians don't kill other Asians. This idea of, that the Asians were being sent to Southeast Asia, on behalf of the government and trying to fight for freedom. And there were Asians in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. It was a really difficult time for Asian Americans to try to wrap their mind around. And then the last activist I'll share with you is Grace Lee Boggs, who was an activist in Detroit, Michigan, doing work around racial and economic justice. And she was a really important person doing this kind of work, and passed away recently. And so this is the narrative, is I try to counter this idea that Asians weren't part of this racial justice work or economic justice work, but in truth had always been part of these particular movements. So
Skip ahead a little bit in the video and skip to the part about Asian Lutherans. This video covers a lot, so I'll provide a link at the very end of today if you wanted to go back and watch it. There are parts that we're skipping around it.
To Asia. So there's, Christianity in Asian communities has been around for a long, long time. And so when we think specifically about Asians and a Lutheran experience, what we know is that there are about 22,000 people who are AAPI identified in ELCA churches. There are 85 specific AAPI specific ELCA congregations. These are congregations that are predominantly an ethnic group or a racial group. And so there are like, for example, spent a lot of time in Hmong. So HMONG, for those who are interested, HMONG, so Hmong specific ELCA congregation. And so we spoke Hmong, the sermons were Hmong, everything was Hmong, the congregation members were predominantly Hmong. There are 22 Asian languages spoken throughout ELCA congregations. And I think the most interesting part is that even though we have these ELCA or AAPI specific ELCA congregations, the majority, so 65%, actually worship in a non-AAPI congregation. So, for example, today I belong to a congregation that is predominantly white. And so there's 65% of AAPI folks worship in about 3,000 congregations across the ELCA. And so you have most people who are Asian American who are not at an AAPI specific congregation. And I wanted to show some different texts that if you're interested in reading more, I encourage you to do more research on your own. But this is a text written by Dr. Edmund Yee, who is a retired professor now. But he published one of the very first books on, the Asian Lutheran experience. And this book is called The Soaring Brain. He's got 3 different volumes that really talk about different aspects of Asian American experiences and Asian Lutheran experiences in particular. So what are some challenges and opportunities? And again, this is another text that's written by Dr. Edmund Yee and edited, and in addition to Louie. This is called Behold the Stream, History of Asian Lutheran Witness. And here they document from very, very early on the predecessor bodies, Lutheran bodies, right, and some experiences of Asian pastors over time, both lay leaders and ordained folks. And so, I said the context, right, of the larger Asian American experience in the US is really important because we, exist in a backdrop of a history of exclusion and marginalization. And so what does that look like when we are in society and when we come into the church, where 65% of Asian Americans, right, are worshiping in predominantly white churches or congregations, right? We carry or we bring with us, right? And we have also experienced, right, a history of exclusion and marginalization. So that becomes and continues into our church community and the relationships that we're trying to build in church, right? And so what happens is there are these layers of invisibility, right? Visibility in terms of being Asian American, but now you're Asian American in a church that is predominantly white, and then you also then are part of a congregation that's predominantly. So there's just these layers of invisibility that many Asian Americans experience within the church. In addition to that, there are lots of ways that that we have to navigate Lutheran traditions. And I use the word tradition, I was gonna put that in quotes, but there are some things where they assume of what it means to be Lutheran. I'm from the Twin Cities, and so this is the land of Lutherans, but when I tell people Lutheran, they're very surprised. Oh, you don't look Lutheran, is the thing that I oftentimes get told. And so the things that I thought were traditions in the church, that the Hmong congregation, when I joined a predominantly white church, I was very surprised, but there were traditions within that church too. And I think part of it is like, how do we hold on to these traditions? I think that's important, but also how do we not use traditions to exclude people or to minimize their own the other experiences that they may have had in a Lutheran church. And I think part of that is how do we balance Lutheran theology while at the same time preserving cultural and linguistic diversity. And so one of the ways that lots of people think about is this idea of, whether or not localization, accommodation, or indigenization is important of Christianity. And so what that means is, are there aspects of church life or Lutheran theology that, how do we contextualize that for the communities that we are, living among or working within or in community with, right? And I think that's, those are the different ways that we have to think creatively, right? Strategically, right? To think about how do we include people into our communities. And so I wanted to share with you just some ways of what that's looked like. And so just some images for you, and we've got a little bit of time left. So here are a couple of different ways. So this is one of the images of a church building. This is a Chinese congregation in Washington in that particular synod. I have some images of different ordained pastors who are leading these ethnic specific congregations and doing work in their communities. On the very top is an image of the very first May is Asian American Pacific Islander Awareness Month or Heritage Month. And so we had our very first celebration last May to recognize Asian Americans in the church. And this was in St. Paul, Minnesota, which was really great because it was local, I could get to it. And so this was a kind of a forum or panelists of people talking about their experience.
Yeah, so we'll pause there and I'll let you watch the rest on your own, because again, there's a lot to this video and quite a bit that we skipped over, but I wanted to give us some time for reflection and discussion afterwards. So Peter, if you wanted to cue the slide, just with some questions. So I just wanted to offer these to you as a way for us to talk about the videos that we just saw. So first, what reactions do you have to Dr. Mua's presentation? What was new or surprising to you? The two concepts that Dr. Mua presents are the perpetual foreigner, sometimes also called the forever foreigner, and the model minority stereotypes. Have you seen these depicted in culture and society in the church? How do they impact public perception of people of Asian descent and how they are treated culturally and politically? And then what opportunities do we have at St. Mark's for engaging with San Francisco's Asian American communities, organizations, and churches? I think St. Mark's is unique in the sense that we sit in a community that is, in some ways, more predominantly Asian than in a place like Minneapolis, where Dr. Moa speaks to us from. So we have, significant Asian American communities, organizations, and churches here. So how can we at St. Mark's then partner with those entities? So if anyone wants to share any of their thoughts, reflections, reactions, we can pass the mics around.
I think the first that got to me is forever a foreigner. I hadn't thought of that at all. And just, oh, that's really hard, very difficult to overcome, to always explain where you're from. You know, somebody would ask me, my heritage is German, and Norwegian, but I'm American, just like Asian American. Yeah. Thank you. That one made me think.
Good morning. We have a group of about 20 Chinese speakers at Martin Luther Tower, but I don't know if there's anyone in the congregation that speaks Chinese. It would really be great if somebody, a Lutheran who speaks Chinese, could go to the tower and talk to the body about the Lutheran Church. I don't know if that will ever be possible. We also have a group of Russian speakers who are about maybe 10 or 15 who don't speak any English at all. So again, cultural competence is really important. And again, they're not aware of the activities that are going on in the church because of language barriers.
An opportunity to kind of marry the two thoughts that were just offered on that. Yes, cultural competence is incredibly important, and being able to offer resources in that way. While at the same time not assuming that, because you have persons of Asian descent in your congregation, those language resources are necessarily there. I've had lots of incidents, in my own life and, in this congregation where, there have been presumptions made, for example, that, oh, you're a person of Asian descent, can you please go welcome this visitor? And, and oftentimes I can welcome the visitor just as much as the person sitting next to me in the pew. So.
Thank you for bringing this to us today, Marisa. I know that there are some, last week we had something going on. I unfortunately missed it, but in the afternoon there were lots of people here partaking in a celebration, it seemed like. And I wonder if there are ways that we can build on that and relationship that maybe we're making with the community. I don't know if is there a sense that we had, here we sit and that we had people from the community here for the celebration last week that might not have been here if there hadn't been a celebration? I don't know if anybody knows that, but yes, yeah, okay. But I think we getting people into the sanctuary on a Sunday morning is a noble goal, but that may not be the way to start. I think for us, if we can engage our community in ways that make sense, whatever that might be, is a good way to start. So I'm hopeful that there are some little inroads.
Share the same hopes. Yeah, and I believe that I wasn't here yet either, last week, Mary. But I know that, St. Mark's has provided space, for meetings for, like the association, I think, that was here in partnership with the Square last week, and that's how that partnership was formed. So whatever ways that we can offer the resources that we have to these communities is a way of inviting their participation in our community. So I wanted to offer up some of the resources that maybe were not mentioned in the video. And one of those is the last link on the slide, and you can scan the QR code on the slide to get access to the slide and to the hyperlinks. One of those is the Association of Asian and Pacific Islanders of the ELCA, which is an association that brings together all of the ministries that work with Asian and Pacific Islander communities around the world. And Pastor Tita Valeriano is actually called to lead that particular association. Pastor Tita was an interim pastor here. A lot of us remember her and love her and still see her. Well, I think she was here for pageant. I've seen her in the last 6 months or so. So again, just some resources that were offered in the video, some that were not, but I encourage all of you to explore those at your leisure. Are there any other thoughts, Pam?
Comment. First, thank you, Marisa, for showing this presentation. Also, is this on YouTube?
Yes, it's on the YouTube, and there's a link there. There's a link there on the slide. If you go onto the slide, which you can get to by scanning the QR code, there's that video link right there. So you can watch the entirety of the video as well as the other presentations that were offered as part of that Racial Day of Healing back in January. Well, thank you everyone for your time and attention this evening. I think we're taking the next 2 Sundays off, forum, and then reconvening the first Sunday of June.